they suddenly went over the border on the 6th of August, and that's just over 4 weeks ago now. And that created this dynamism, because certainly it forced the Russians to move forces from other places, but not from the place where the Ukrainians would have wanted them to move forces, which is down in the south, in the Donbass, towards Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar. And if anything, it's galvanized the Russians to say, okay, if you're moving some equipment, at least, if not a lot of men, but if you're moving equipment away from the south, this is our opportunity. So the Russians have put much more into trying to take Pokrovsk. And although they're advancing very slowly towards Pokrovsk, and they're losing again, we know, over 1,000 men a day on average, which is they're losing them to dead and wounded, and they're losing a huge amount of equipment. Even this week, they've lost well over 100 armored vehicles. So they're losing, but they're grinding forward because they're without concern for losses. They're just going to take Pokrovsk. That's the view. So the war has become more dynamic than at any time since the Ukrainian offensive in the autumn of 2022. So things are moving. And they're moving towards the winter, because Ukrainian climate is the seasons are very predictable. And so we know that the winter will really start from last week of October, first week of November, when movement will become more difficult. It'll get cold, then it'll get wet. Well, get wet and then it'll get cold. And so big offensives become not impossible, but much more difficult in those circumstances. So both sides are playing for advantage before the winter sets in, which means between now and the end of October. So we are seeing more movement, and I think we will see more territories change hands, both in Kursk and possibly in the south.
They do seem to have gone, Russian forces, all out in the push towards Pokrovsk. Is there a risk of Russian forces overextending there?
Yes, there is. Their losses can't be sustained in Pokrovsk for too long. It may be that they will take Pokrovsk, and in any case, once they're within artillery range, which they more or less are now, they'll do to Pokrovsk what they did to Mariupol and Severodonetsk and Avdiivka and Bakhmut, that they'll shell it. They will reduce it to rubble and then take control of the rubble. That's the way they do it. And so Pokrovsk is in danger that is now the outcome. Pokrovsk was a city of about 60, 70,000 people. It's said there are about 25,000 people still there. One imagines that they will get out pretty quickly. And what will be left will be the rubble as from the eastern part of the city spreading to the center and the west as the Russians move closer. That would seem to be the next stage in this process. But the Russians can overextend themselves. And indeed, if the Ukrainians can summon up more forces, that they have an opportunity as well to chop Russian forces off as they move towards Pokrovsk. So they're not out of options at all. So tactically, the Ukrainians, can do more in Kursk. They're almost goading the Russians in Kursk to come and make a proper fight of it. But the Russians are moving in troops from all over the place, but not from the south. But because of that, the Russians have got not much of an operational reserve in the south. And if the Ukrainians can summon up some more forces from somewhere, they might actually be able to damage Russian forces around Pokrovsk. But that hasn't happened yet. We don't know. But I have to say, with all of this, it's not entirely clear that the Ukrainians have a united military strategy. They are pushing in Kursk for reasons that we've talked about. They're defending in Pokrovsk and probably not going to be successful in the longer run. They're holding in other areas, they're pressurizing Crimea and still attacking refineries in Russia, in the Rostov region, and so on. It's hard from the outside to see a unified strategy from all of this, other than to, as it would, keep tweaking the tail of the Russian military to keep showing that the Russian military are beatable. I think that's probably as far as the strategy goes at the moment.
So is there a way of pulling that strategy together from those different ways that Ukraine is fighting this war that you just mentioned?
Well, they could if they had a lot more equipment, and they need a lot more ammunition. They need a lot more air defense ammunition, missiles for anti-air missiles, and they need more of everything. And particularly, they need to hold the present strategy, such as it is, in place long enough to mobilize more troops. I mean, they are getting more troops. I mean, they're doubling the number of troops who are being sent to training units because of changes in the mobilization law and tighter mobilization. And President Zelensky is suffering because of that politically, because it's not popular. But he is insisting that Ukraine must mobilize fully for this war, and that's understandable because they're fighting for their lives. So if the Ukrainians can hold on, then the pendulum will, I think, begin to turn back to them, at least in numbers, at some point over the winter and the spring. So there is a sort of there may be an inner coherence to this, but it's hard to see when their troops are so heavily stretched around the whole of the front what they can get out of this. If they can't make the Kursk operation work by saving Pokrovsk, then they may stay in Kursk for a long time, and Putin still won't react. And I find that very odd. I mean, Putin's argument is threadbare. What he says, very, very peculiar. He said, "Look, there are 5 oblasts, regions in Ukraine, which are Russian territory. You know, he claims Luhansk and Donetsk and Zaporizhia and Kherson and Crimea." He said, "Well, we're already fighting in these 5 sovereign areas of Russia. So fighting in Kursk is just fighting in a 6th sovereign area of Russia. They're all sovereign areas of Russia." Now, that is a sort of strangely logical argument if you accept that he is a natural imperialist. You know, everywhere he claims belongs to him because he claims it. But I'm not sure that the Russian people or the Russian elite will go along with that. They know the difference between Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea and Kursk, for heaven's sake. And they know the difference between the symbolic importance of Kursk in the Second World War. It has the same status as Stalingrad in the national memory. They know the difference between that and Zaporizhia, for heaven's sake.
Indeed. You mentioned just now that President Zelensky is not very popular politically at home. The politics in Ukraine at the moment are unpredictable. The spree of high-level resignations at the top level there, including Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's top foreign diplomat. Why now? What has triggered this?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, Kuleba has been rumoured to be stepping down for some time, or that Zelensky felt that he needed to replace him for a while. I don't think it's because of any particular lack of performance, but I mean, Kuleba himself may be getting very tired. I mean, he may be exhausted, and he hasn't made a great success of getting more weapon systems, going around the chancelleries of Europe and in the United States and really persuading them of Ukraine's case any more than the president could. So it may be that he's exhausted what he can do as a sort of a vibrant force for Ukrainian nationalism. That's possible. I'm in a way, I'm not as worried about that from Ukraine's point of view as I am of the stepping down of Kamyshin, Alexander Kamyshin. And Kamyshin was the man who used to run Ukrainian railways very, very efficiently, even after the war started. And Kamyshin was transferred from doing the railways to being the Minister for Strategic Industries, which is basically the war economy, creating war production. And he's very dynamic, very well respected, extremely effective. I always say he has a very strange hairstyle. It's sort of a cross between a Mohican and a punk hairstyle. I always think he looks like something out of an ABBA tribute band. And he's got a fierce look, but he's very effective. And he has stepped down from being Minister for Strategic Industries. And he's said, or made a statement attributed to him, he will still have a role, but he's not quite sure what it is. And if anything, I would be expecting this man to be promoted. But if he's been sidelined in some way, that is worrying, because that sort of suggests that Zelensky is prioritizing loyalty, maybe over ability. I hope not. And I hope there is something very important for Kamyshin to do, because I rate him very highly. But if you look at the other resignations, I mean, 2 deputy prime ministers, one responsible for European affairs and one responsible for NATO issues, Justice Minister, the Environmental Minister, the State Property Fund Manager, a presidential aide. So 8 key people have all resigned. And that's, in one sense, that's not unusual, in that any president is entitled to refresh his team. But he may be going forward now into a difficult winter. He may be looking towards elections next year because he can't keep postponing them. And so, and he has to bolster his domestic popularity, which is slipping. and he has to have a team around him who are loyal because he's going to have to take some very unpopular decisions during the winter. So you can see a sort of the reason behind all of this, but undoubtedly it's an unsettling time for the capital of a country that's at war.
Just the sheer numbers that the Russians have and the way that they fight, so that they send in these small units almost on suicide missions that tie up the Ukrainians within that sector of the battlefield, and then they can advance elsewhere. And they described it to me as suicidal, but something that, and how do they persuade the soldiers to do this? I mean, in some cases, they said that there were a lot of convicts fighting in that area, which is a bit like what we had in Bakhmut, but they said that the tactics being used were very different because they're really advancing on a broader front line, and they've kind of got the initiative along that whole front line.
And when you talk about those kind of tactics, what kind of challenges are they presenting to the Ukrainian troops?
I mean, they are very, very aware that there are fewer of them. That they are, they just say that we kill far more of them than they get of us. Although there are losses on both sides, they said that the Russians are losing many more men, but it just doesn't seem to make an enormous difference to what's going on the ground. And I think that that's bewildering and frustrating. I was speaking to a guy who was leading the battle in a place improbably called New York, which is sort of it's actually sort of further back than the advance on Pokrovsk. So the vanguard of the advance on Pokrovsk sort of looks like an arrow, and they're back here. And he would like to cut off that salient, go behind the Russians, but the orders they're getting from higher up make that impossible for them.
It's interesting. I was just thinking about what you were saying earlier about how the advance had accelerated, and you had. I mean, it really. It almost seems like you've got two tales of what's actually happening in that area. On one hand, you hear it's a very slow, grinding advance by the Russians. Then you're telling me the extreme opposite.
It has been a slow grinding advance for some time. So what happened was that in February there was a place called Avdiivka that the Ukrainians had to give up because they couldn't hold it, and that was really a direct consequence of the delay in ammunition reaching them because of politics in Washington. So what was going on in Congress, where they were trying to tie together the Israel aid, but then you had the senators who are sort of more pro-Russian, I suppose, or more sympathetic to the Russian idea of settling this and having negotiations. So when that happened, this is really this is sort of the tail end of that battle, or it's the next stage of that battle. And that part of the fight was very grinding. What has happened in this one is that the Russians have sped up.
Mm. And you were mentioning there about some of the complaints that you've been hearing. What is the morale like of the Ukrainian forces that you met?
It was strong in the Kursk operation and much lower in the Donbass. I mean, most of it was coming at the soldiers themselves, I feel, are sort of doing what they can on the ground, but there is their expressions of discontent were with the command and the way that the battle's being fought on, a number of levels.
Yeah, and how intense is the fight? The soldiers that you met in the Donbass. How intense is the fighting there?
Is extremely intense. I mean, one of the most extraordinary examples was, again, this commander in New York, where he showed us these drone images of how they were fighting building to building. And he even said, often they found themselves fighting within the same building. And so it's not even street fighting. There's no front line there. Essentially, they're almost so mixed up. It means you can't really use artillery there because you can't use it for the simple reason you might catch your own people with your artillery. So that is pretty brutal fighting, and I think the army chief in Ukraine he called the fighting there exceptionally brutal. But they were literally talking about that not being able to find these people that they're fighting against, even knowing that they're right there, and then discovering that they were in a basement and actually setting fire to tires to smoke them out the basement so that they could then engage them in fighting. I mean, this is very close combat, and that's pretty intense stuff.
And you mentioned a little bit about the way they were feeling about what they were having to contend with, given what's going on with the Kursk operation. I mean, did they say what they thought overall about the Kursk operation?
Yeah, I mean, there were mixed views on that. Some people think it's had much of more of an impact than others do. Um, there were some who thought it was just a stupid idea. That was probably a minority view. I think a lot of people saw that there was a political narrative that the Kursk operation had changed, and that that could be as influential as the military actual sort of battlefield maneuvers. But one commander did say to me that, okay, they did it, now what? Did they actually make a plan? How far are they going to go? And his view of it was, now that having done it, they had an enormous number of soldiers up there just fighting to hold the positions, and they're throwing ammunition that they feel that could be better used in Donbass. So they're throwing artillery and brigades at holding this. His view was, you should just mine it all and get out, because you won't be able to hold it.
And while you were waiting to go into Russia, into Kursk Oblast, you were in Sumy, and you had the opportunity before you went in to meet some of the Ukrainian troops who've been injured in that operation. Can you tell me what they told you coming out?
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, they talked about when they'd first gone in, how little resistance they met. And that was pretty interesting. How far they've been able to go, like several days before there was any real fighting taking place. These were people who are lightly injured. I would go to the hospital and just sort of hang around out front and wait for people to come out to have a cigarette, and that's quite often the best way to get an unmediated version. So there's no one around listening to what they're saying. You're getting what they really think. What I noticed over the course of days was that they started to talk about it getting much more difficult. And so I think the final time I went, before. So some people had come from Donbass originally, and they described that. They said it was like a vacation. It was like a holiday, the change, because it had been so easy to go in. As time wore on, and maybe the last time before I actually went into Kursk, they were talking about a much harder battle, and with the Russians actually starting to push them back, which I don't think we've heard of much of from Kyiv itself, but they were very clear that the Russians were actually retaking positions from them.
Okay. Can you tell me a bit more then about your time in Kursk?
Yeah, so my time in Kursk really was within the within the town of Suja and some of the villages that were sort of closer to the border. So what I was able to do there, given I had spoken a lot to the soldiers who'd been in there, what was interesting was to speak to the Russian civilians themselves. And, despite the fact that they had been living so close to the Ukrainian border, they really felt that the war there had absolutely nothing to do with them. It wasn't, something that impacted their lives, because that was a quiet part of the border. And that is one of the reasons I think the Ukrainians picked that place to go, because there wasn't much of a military presence there. So really, the overwhelming, impression I got from them was one that they're still in shock that this has happened. They couldn't quite believe it. The Ukrainian troops themselves seem to be going out of their way to present a sort of benevolent face of what they insisted was a very temporary occupation. And so they were they were bringing supplies for Ukrainian civilians. They had a doctor there that people could go and see. And they said, quite explicitly, that they aimed to show the Russians that they were not behaving the way the Russian troops had behaved when they were occupying swathes of Ukraine in the early days of the invasion.
And when you say, and you've written about it, about the Russians you met, never thinking that their lives would be affected by the war in Ukraine, in spite of the fact they were so close to Ukraine, did you ever get a sense of whether they actually bought into the way President Putin presents the war inside Russia?
Hmm. Well, you've got to understand that these are the people who were stuck there, left there. They're not, the cream of society, to put it mildly. So these weren't necessarily the most sort of thinking or aware people. A lot of them were old or disabled. Some of them were palpably alcoholics, and they were people who just got stuck there because there was no evacuation whatsoever, and people had to leave under their own steam. So I will just say that to start with. A lot of people insisted to me that they just didn't know anything, that they didn't watch the news. Now, I have no way of knowing if that's true or not, or whether they just didn't want to commit to an opinion. Some people, a couple of people, one man condemned Putin by name. Other people said, war is never a good thing. It doesn't bring anything good for others. But then there was a lot of simply saying, we have nothing to do with politics. We're simple people. There was one woman who pushed back quite strongly when she was being shown by Ukrainian soldiers these videos of interviews with Ukrainians who'd been under Russian occupation, and some of the damage and some of the things that had been done to them either in bombardment or under occupation. And she really didn't want to hear that. She kept saying, well, we have that in Russia too. When there was footage of damage shown, she would say, well, the Ukrainians are shelling Belgorod too. And then footage came up of the disinterment of mass graves in Bucha. And I said to her, do you have mass graves in Belgorod too? She conceded they did not.
And those people that you met, some of them had contacts or had friends and family in Ukraine itself. How did they view the situation now and the fact that they cannot see those people? How did they view the future relationships with those people?
Yeah, well, I mean, they haven't been able to see those people since the war began. That's what was a reasonably open border, and people would go either way. Apparently, Ukrainian dairy products are better, so the Russians told me. So they would come out across to Sumy Oblast to buy them there. So there was two-way traffic, and some of them had studied in those places. So they haven't seen those people for 2.5 years, and some people spoke of their regrets about that. Their solution to that is not one that would gain much currency in Ukraine, because those who wanted to see, things restored to normal and ordinary relations with the Ukrainians wanted to do so under the framework of a revived Soviet Union. And that is obviously not what is wanted on the Ukrainian side of the border. So, I mean, I think there was this, it was almost the attitude of a much larger neighbor to the smaller neighbor. Oh, we make peace by, you just sort of coming back under our control and it will be fine. That's definitely not the attitude in Ukraine, and it's not something I see happening.
And when you were there were hundreds of Russian soldiers who had been captured, among them young conscripts, also Chechen fighters. And you mentioned that when you were talking in Sumy to Ukrainian forces who'd been lightly injured, they told you that the counteroffensive was starting to take hold in Sumy by the Russians. I mean, how much evidence was there at the time that you were there that was on the cards? And what can you tell us about that at the moment?
About the Russians taking back Kursk? I mean, I think they will certainly take back, from what's been happening since I left there, they were starting to sort of nibble back parts of the area that the Ukrainian forces had taken. It probably won't be that fast. It probably won't move as fast as things are moving in the Donbass, simply for the reason that Putin has clearly decided that, as a stated objective is to take Donbass. And that was a downgraded objective when Russia failed to march on Kyiv and take it in totality. He seems to have decided that he can tolerate the presence of Ukrainian troops on Russian soil more than he can afford to undermine the battle in the Donbass. So that's, that was a gamble that has not paid off for Ukraine either, that those troops have not been moved from the Donbass. It does mean that it could take Russia much longer to try and claw back that area.
Belgorod wouldn't necessarily make sense, because having attacked into it twice last year, the Russians are prepared for something coming in there. But keeping the Russians guessing as to where the next phase of this Ukrainian operation is going to be is critical. They kept the mini invasion into Kursk very, very close hold indeed, and many Western countries weren't aware of it until after it had happened. And the Ukrainians will want to keep the Russians guessing. The Kerch Bridge is one of the next logical objectives, as is putting further pressure into Crimea. The Ukrainians had been putting pressure on Crimea quite a lot earlier this year with some success. And of course, they had real success last year in attacking the Black Sea Fleet headquarters and the Black Sea with a number of raids attacking air defense sites and airfields. That's tailed off a little bit. I would expect that to build up again. And we may see further activity down across the river deltas, putting pressure on the Russian defenses more in the southeast. But it's the Ukrainians deciding on where and when the next operation will be. They have probably planned 2 or 3 different options. And what we'll see is they will probe and have a little look and test and see what is the best option for them to go. And that will then be phase 2. But this is going to be a multi-phase operation, I suspect, to try and keep the Russians on the back foot and set the conditions for the Ukrainians to potentially counterattack properly on the Eastern Front at some stage in 2025.
And you mentioned the Eastern Front. Of course, one of their objectives of the Ukrainians in Kursk was to kind of draw away troops from some of those crucial areas that are under pressure there at the moment. Have they had any success so far in doing that?
In a one-word answer, no. And I think this is what will be keeping the Ukrainians watching closely and keeping their options open. The Russians have sort of redoubled their effort, and they're attacking into a town called Pokrovsk, and they've been pushing quite hard. Now, Pokrovsk is sort of northwest of Avdiivka, where there was an awful lot of effort put in last year, but it's a significant location for the Ukrainians because it's a hub of the rail and road logistics coming together. A city of about 100,000 before the war. The Ukrainians have just issued a compulsory evacuation order for all civilians in it. The Russians are punching hard because if they can control that, they're going to cause the Ukrainians real difficulty in maintaining the logistics support to the rest of the troops that are operating across the Donbass. It seems that Putin is doing something that is militarily right. You select your main effort and you continue with your main effort with everything that you've got unless you're forced to go and do something different. And therefore, he hasn't allowed his troops to be distracted by the Kursk mini invasion. He's keeping his effort on this main effort to capture Pokrovsk, but it's costing him an awful lot. And the Russians are throwing thousands of troops at the Ukrainian defenses. The Ukrainians are, I think, short of trained troops at the moment. There's reports coming out to say that they're short of ammunition, artillery ammunition in particular, and that will be not giving them the best opportunities to defend. And the Russians are using meat grinder tactics, the same sort of tactics that we saw Prigozhin's Wagner group using in Bakhmut for 18 plus months. And the Russians seem to be content that they can lose 1,000, 1,200, 1,300 troops a day as they gather and gain a few tens or hundreds of meters each day, but they're advancing.
And there must be a level of political risk to Putin for this. He's still got these massive 1,000-man-a-day losses in Donbass. He's also now having to use conscripts, which has always been a politically risky issue for Putin, has it not? Is that not, as 2 issues compounded into one, going to cause more difficulty for him?
I think if you look under the surface of some of the information that's coming out, and it's really difficult to analyze without you properly getting onto the front line and talking to people yourself. So I'm going on reports that I've read on Telegram, which is one of the biggest sources of disinformation that's out there, and other reports from people I've heard on the ground and all the rest of it. But Putin's use of conscripts in Kursk, kind of not declaring that a military operation, is significant, and that suggests that Putin is suffering shortage of manpower. There are also reports of troops that are going into Kursk that are not infantry troops, or they're not armored troops. They've been taken out of other units and just put in there to try and deal with things. That again suggests Putin is short of manpower. His meat grinder tactics in Donbass are really affecting them quite badly. And if we look at, he's had to go to North Korea and ask North Korea to provide some of the specialist manpower, engineering capability and all the rest of it to come and backfill so that he can take his troops and push them into this meat grinder. Putin is gambling very carefully that he can outbet the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are suffering huge losses as well. We haven't got the sort of numbers from them. They're keeping that very close hold, but they're having difficulty maintaining the number of troops they need on the front line, and allegedly that's affecting morale. They haven't got their best trained troops in that eastern area, which is why the Russian meat grinder tactics seem to be working. Putin is gambling quite heavily on this. Zelensky is also gambling quite heavily on this, and it's too early to tell who's going to win. If you forced me to, I'd say that Zelensky's probably got the upper hand at the moment.
I was going to say, because there is another consideration, isn't there, here? The Ukrainian winter comes in roughly October. Yeah. What sort of impact is that going to have on fighting? Could it slow both the offensives?
It will slow both the offensives. But what we haven't seen from the Ukrainians so far is the use of their heavy armour and armoured formations attacking in, because they don't have the wherewithal to protect that properly. They can't create an air defence bubble around ground forces going in, where they put heavy ground forces going in formation level, and that's battalion, regiment, brigade, division-sized forces to punch in with armoured engineer and armoured artillery and all of the rest supporting them, because they haven't got those force packages together yet. They haven't got the ability to create that local air superiority. For the Russians, they will dig in and you use the weather as an excuse to try and defend more, but they can't do large armored maneuver. But they haven't been doing that anyway. So things will slow down. What the reason why armor can't operate particularly well in the winter is because the Ukrainian fields get very, very boggy. Their mud sucks. And will hold armoured vehicles in place and get them stuck. And when they're stuck, they're very, very easy to, for artillery and for drones and other things to pick off. So neither side will want to leave their armoured vehicles too vulnerable. And the weather, when it gets wet, it then gets cold, and it gets very cold, and that will just sap the morale out of troops that are stuck in trenches and trying to defend things. The Ukrainians are slightly better equipped than the Russians. Therefore, they are likely to be able to maintain their morale better than the Russians can. The Russians, if they can increase the amount of indirect fire that they got from artillery, from rockets and everything else, can try and have an effect on that Ukrainian morale. This is where the Ukrainians need to counter that with more Western artillery, because our artillery can outrange anything the Russians have got generally, but it only works if you've got the ammunition. So again, we're in a time period when the West needs to make sure that Ukraine is properly prepared for the winter months. And Ukraine will use the winter months then to plan what they're going to do as spring and next year's maneuver opportunities start to appear.
And at their current rate, does it look like the Russians will take Pokrovsk by the start of winter?
That's very difficult. The Ukrainians know the tactical and operational significance of losing it, and therefore I suspect they will get to a point where they will throw many more resources at it. They may even do that at the expense of resources they put into Kursk. There's been reports in the last 24, 48 hours of the Ukrainians rotating new troops in, and they seem to have stabilized the front line and stop Russian advances. This is potentially going to turn into another Bakhmut, and therefore but it's a much larger city, and we could see the city being completely destroyed in the way that we have with Bakhmut and Avdiivka and others.
Elsewhere in this conflict, there is a continuing campaign to strike Russian oil refineries by Ukraine. Just over the weekend, a Moscow refinery was hit by drones. That's obviously right next to the capital. Has Russia had any success yet in countering that campaign?
No, Russia's it's had minimal success in shooting some of the drones down that have been attacking into Russia. Again, this is a masterstroke by the Ukrainians. This is General Budanov the head of the Ukrainian military intelligence, targeting in, and he's attacking the Russian center of gravity. He's attacking their wherewithal to be able to continue to fund their special military operation by attacking the oil refineries, and importantly within that, the oil storage facilities. What a lot of people don't realize is that the refineries, the output from the refineries can only be to the level that you can store the processed product that you've got out of it before it is then exported elsewhere. So if you destroy a lot of the oil storage tanks and the fuel storage tanks that we see, that reduces the ability to store stuff, and therefore reduces the capacity in the Russian refinery business to be able to then get enough product to go out and to sell and everything else. And therefore the Ukrainians are attacking all of that. They're also attacking Russian energy infrastructure as well, in the same way the Russians have attacked Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And what that's doing is that's then bringing the message home yet again to local Russians whenever they're having their electricity cut, they're having difficulty getting hold of fuel and elsewhere. So the Ukrainians are selecting and maintaining their aim in their operation to try and undermine Putin's position, and they're continuing with that. We've got a standoff between two leaders and two different tactics here. I think the Ukrainians have got the edge because they've got the initiative at the moment, and the more I see of Vladimir Putin, the less options he seems to have as to where he's going to go, and I think that is causing him real difficulty when it comes to his decision making at the moment.
And Putin's response to the incursion, like you say, there is now defense in place, but so far it's failed to really push back Ukraine in the region. If Ukraine dig in now, which we're starting to see some evidence that they might be doing, how hard is it going to be to dislodge them?
Well, I think look at the Russian approach. It's very interesting indeed. One of the Ukrainian military objectives, I think, was to tear troops away from the attacks that are going on in the east, where the Russians are having some success. Now, that hasn't happened. And I think Putin is deliberately trying to keep the pressure up in the east to keep this horns of a dilemma for the Ukrainians. But he's also been interesting in the way he's allocated responsibility for this. He's maintained it as an internal security situation, a counter-terrorist situation. So it's the FSB that are leading rather than the Ministry of Defense. That's the Russian internal security organization. They provide all the border guards. They provide similar services to MI5 in the UK and all the rest of it. But he's given them lead responsibility. So he hasn't turned it into part of his special military operation. This is causing a few interesting dilemmas and a few interesting tactics. One of the interesting tactics is he can then use conscripts, which under the Russian constitution are not allowed to be deployed into a conflict zone. Well, this isn't a conflict zone. So he's using conscripts to go in, and that's why the Ukrainians are capturing so many. But it also causes a dilemma if he tries to move any of his troops then from eastern Ukraine up round to deal with anything, because whenever they're in a conflict zone, they get additional money. If he moves them around into Kursk, because it's not declared as a conscript, as a conflict zone, they will lose money. And there have already been complaints from some of the Russian formations that have been moved, very small numbers, but have been moved around, that they're losing pay. So this is not good for morale for those that are on the front line. They may have a better chance of surviving. They may have a better chance of being captured by the Ukrainians and surviving longer, but it's causing a real dilemma. And that dilemma is being enhanced by the fact that it's increasing the visibility of what's going on inside Ukraine, but amongst the Russian people. This is something that Vladimir Putin has not been able to keep away from the Russian people in the press and everything else. And the longer the Ukrainians continue to occupy Russian land, and Putin seems to do nothing decisive about it, the weaker Putin will appear, not just to the Russian people, but to his inner circle and his oligarchs, and also to those international leaders that tacitly support him. So in particular, Xi Jinping is the one that he is focusing on most, because he is requiring that tacit support to keep him going from China. So we're in a very interesting period of time at the moment. Putin is trying to bluff it out as much as he can. we have to see where that goes.
The Kremlin are often hesitant to deploy and use these conscripts in any form of real conflict. And there's something of a history in Russia, isn't there, of conscription becoming a problem for the regime in Moscow?
Well, you have to understand that the key motivation for getting soldiers to fight in Russia, as in any war, is in promising soldiers something in return for doing the fighting, for risking their lives, for making a huge sacrifice of some sort. And that might be honor, fame, glory, monetary rewards, as frequently works with Russia's army. But Russia's conscripts simply aren't meant to be. They're not primed to fight. They're offered very little in return for their service. And so suddenly they find themselves thrown into the breach. Very little motivation, relatively little training, having expected to basically sit out their year of service doing some busybody work, maybe in the far east of Russia, manning a border post, maybe sitting on slightly closer to the front lines in Kursk. And that leaves us with a problem, because these are not going to be highly motivated soldiers. These are soldiers who, when we look back at Russian history, in particular, if we look at the wars in Afghanistan and Chechnya, may feel as they're easily beaten by a superior Ukrainian force, somewhat angry, shall we say, towards the president and towards the society that sent them there.
What risks do this new wave of conscripts dragged into the war through Kursk pose to the Kremlin?
Well, of course, we're in very early days. But let's look at the Afghan war as an example of what might happen. Now, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979 to prop up or to overturn the communist government there and install their own communist government. And this was all heralded in a blaze of propaganda that is going to seem very familiar if you've been reading Russian narratives about the war recently. That is, it's a democratic mission, it's about supporting the local population, it's about law and justice, i.e. all these sort of high-flown values. But very rapidly, the Kremlin got drawn into a long and pretty awful conflict that they just couldn't win. And just like today, they needed to fill that space with more and more bodies. So they sent conscripts in. Conscripts who were part of a Soviet Union that was rapidly unraveling, who didn't see much value in fighting, who didn't really see the need for a war at all, and who certainly didn't get any rewards when they came home. They weren't fated as heroes. They weren't given the special benefits that, for example, their grandfathers had been when they came home from World War II. And what happened to this group of conscripts was that they felt sidelined by society, especially in the 1990s, as Russia collapsed in the post-Soviet era. And they basically became, not all of them, of course, but many of them, these young, traumatized, disappointed men became involved in criminality. In the criminal gangs, in the mafia, they rented themselves out as mercenaries and fanned out across the post-Soviet space and ended up everywhere from Belarus to Tajikistan, assisting authorities and the opposition as well in carrying out violent acts. And at home, of course, what they effectively were doing was perpetuating, if not quite a civil war, then forms of violence and forms of organized, forceful opposition that challenged state authority. And so one has to wonder, as the young men today who are struggling in Ukraine, who are committing violence in Ukraine, who are encouraged to commit violence in Ukraine with very little reward, begin to filter home, where will they end up?
And as you write in your article in the New Statesman, the Kremlin certainly seems to be worried about this, especially in Kursk. What are the ways they're trying to sort of get ahead of this problem? Has there been any signs of reaction yet then from the conscripts themselves, especially in Kursk?
So what we have seen are streams of videos of conscripts surrendering en masse. They're just not willing to fight. Some, of course, are attempting to fight, but Kursk has essentially been given up without much of a battle. Right? The Ukrainians have found it, on the whole, pretty easy going. We've also seen on Russian social media spaces the release of videos from conscripts and from prisoners who are purportedly begging their mothers for help, addressing the president and asking for assistance, detailing bad conditions at the front, and detailing also alleged violence conducted by the Ukrainian military. And I stress allegedly, because once again, we must imagine that the Kremlin may be flooding these spaces with its own fake videos in which it is the Ukrainian army that is conducting violence against conscripts rather than the Russian authorities' own incompetence at allowing Ukraine to invade part of its sovereign territory.
Obviously, the war being in Ukraine is largely fought, as you say, by these mobilized or contracted soldiers. How do they differ from the conscripts? And do they present their own threats as well to Putin?
Well, certainly they do. We might look back to an event that was so massive last year, but which we all seem to have all but forgotten, and that is the Prigozhin armed coup, mutiny, revolt, whatever you're going to call it. It's still not quite clear what he was hoping to achieve, in which he and a fairly large number of, albeit not Ministry of Defense contract soldiers, but men who were out there fighting for the money, marched on Moscow because they felt that the deal that they'd struck with the state had been broken. The pact that they had was somehow thrown away by the Kremlin. But what I would note there is that a much larger number of Wagner men, when they were asked by the Ministry of Defense simply to switch allegiances from Prigozhin to the ministry, did so because they were promised the same payday. The conscripts don't have that. What's the reward for them? And so where are the tensions? Where are the frustrations bubbling up with that group of people?
Of course, these conscripts as well are only one part of the wider problem Putin faces in Kursk. With no sign yet that Ukraine's going to be forced out, what's the wider reaction to the Kursk incursion been in Russia?
It's been a very curious reaction. Because in the first few days, the Russian state was very keen to paint a picture that the nation was mobilizing on behalf of the afflicted residents, those who'd had to flee. And we saw lots and lots of videos of purportedly normal people gathering around, donating food, humanitarian supplies, working in their local community to help people. And we also saw what seemed like mostly pretty badly mocked up stories of columns of Russian tanks and Russian helicopters advancing on Kursk, about to cast the invaders out. And these were trumpeted across the propaganda channels from mainstream media to social media. But since those past first few days, everything's gone quiet. And it looks like the Kremlin is simply hoping to sweep this onto the carpet and make everybody move on and forget about the problem altogether. And there is really very little evidence that Russian society as a whole is reacting particularly negatively. We haven't seen massive amounts of chatter or discomfort that a large chunk of the country has been invaded by its neighbor. The goals of the war to invade and denazify Ukraine, such as they were proclaimed by the Kremlin, have gone completely awry over the last 2.5 years. Instead, there is just this sense of keeping on, keeping on.
In the Donbass, Russia is pushing on Pokrovsk. They've changed tactics there, dismounting their soldiers, seemingly in an attempt to overwhelm Ukrainian defenders. But that's going to push up troop losses, isn't it?
It is. But up until this point, Russia has been able to cover its losses pretty much one for one. It's sustaining huge amounts of losses, but it's bringing in huge amounts of men too. And it is throwing increasingly large sums of money into recruitment, especially through the use of these contract soldiers. And a statistic that I've seen that I believe is true, I've tried to assess that it's true, is that the country is currently spending 1.5% of its GDP on bonuses for contract soldiers.
And so, is there any sign of how long that can go on in Russia? You know, there's been huge losses, 1,000 men a day at some points over the summer. Is that kind of having any impact back in Moscow?
Well, at some point, Russia has to run out of men. This war cannot go on at this rate in perpetuity. But firstly, it doesn't seem to be having much of an effect on Russian public opinion. People don't seem to be too angry about it. And secondly, most importantly, Russia can outlast Ukraine in this type of warfare, because Ukraine really is beginning to find the edges and the limits of how many men and indeed women it can mobilize.
And is there any sign that the Kursk incursion could have changed that at all?
I don't see there's much sign of a big change as a result of Kursk, except to say that the muted response to the issue of conscripts thus far being involved in the war may, and I'm speculating here, so don't necessarily quote me on this, it may indicate to Putin that he might just get away with another slightly larger mobilization of the general population, like the one he did in September 2022, that actually proved quite tricky at the time.
So that is something that is on the cards now in Russia, or is he going to try and get to Pokrovsk and avoid that still?
I wouldn't say it's on the card, but Putin has that card up his sleeve. If he needs to play it, he will.
Meanwhile, back in Kyiv, Zelensky is reshuffling his government. Is that connected to the losses around Pokrovsk at all, or is this kind of just part and parcel of politics in Ukraine during wartime?
Well, I think you've got it in one there, that this seems like an attempt, as Zelensky himself said, to inject some energy into what's become quite a tired government. It's 2.5 years into the war. It must be incredibly tiring and frustrating being in a leadership position, and it is fairly typical for countries to want to rotate senior leaders at this point. I would say that the most important person who has switched roles today, Dmytro Kuleba, the foreign minister, has ruffled some diplomatic feathers in the West from time to time. So there may be an element of Zelensky looking for an advantage with changes in the White House. But more likely, this is simply rotating his team and essentially trying to consolidate a very friendly and pro-Zelensky cabinet who are all on one page.
So it wouldn't be, there has been some suggestion that the reshuffle is done to make the team, the Zelensky team, more popular with the US administration. It's not necessarily entirely about that then, but there is an element of that, is there?
It's hard to read between the lines in warfare, and Zelensky, of course, makes these beautiful and very eloquent speeches about injecting new energy into his government. I think we should probably believe him. But of course, there are always going to be side benefits and tangential benefits to changes like this, but it doesn't strike me as the major reason for a change.
The Ukrainians, it's like fighting a heavyweight, lead-footed heavyweight prize boxer. The Ukrainians are nimble, they're faster. They saw a gap and they went in and popped and staggered much heavier opponent. Right now, what's happening is there seems to be some consolidation. The Ukrainians have captured a relatively large swath of land. And, we can talk about, the square mileage, but it's hundreds of square miles. And, but now you've got to hold it. Now you've got to hold the land on fairly extended fronts, dozens and dozens and dozens of added miles. And meanwhile, they are in a Verdun Somme type battle in the Donbass, where the Russians continue to relentlessly try to take down Pokrovsk, which is one of the keys to Donetsk, to the towns of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. So this is another fight like Bakhmut was, like Avdiivka was, and it is a grinded out fight that the Ukrainians really don't want, because no matter how well you're fighting, you're going to be taking attritional losses, even though they are, the Russians are taking horrendously more. So you have sort of the scales going on right now, and the scale is positive with Kursk, the Kursk operation, and if not, slightly negative, if not neutral, on the other side of Pokrovsk. The Russians see the Donbass as part of their fundamental objective of this war. These were two, Luhansk and Donetsk were the two of the four areas annexed in 2022. And I think that they are going all out. If there's ever going to be a negotiation from a Russian perspective, they want to have control of the four annexed, meaning in Russia, provinces that they conquered pieces of in 22 and a bit in 23. So it's a toss-up. Psychological effects, astounding what the Ukrainians did. It woke up the world that the Ukrainians are still in the fight. They've got moxie. They are fighting, and they're showing again they are fighting existential fight against a ruthless invader who's been at it now for over 2.5 years, and they're still in it. And they've taken their body blows, and they're taking really bad losses relative to the Ukrainian population. But that's the positive piece of it. It also shocked, and we've all been reading the reports, the Russian media, Putin couldn't control the Russian media on this, and the war bloggers. And it's all over Russia that the Ukrainians did this. Now they'll spin it in different ways and make it, this is all NATO backed and sinister and everything else. But the Ukrainians counterpunched hard. But now, I think that, and oh, by the way, it was also a message to the world, especially those countries, the fence sitters, who sort of kind of support Russia, but not entirely. And it also is very important for NATO and like-minded allies and friends of Ukraine that it is still worthy to support this nation that is in a truly desperate existential fight for its existence.
So yesterday, Putin visited Mongolia, defying his International Criminal Court arrest warrant. Obviously, this time last year, Putin didn't attend the BRICS summit in South Africa. Is that warrant still a diplomatic problem for the Kremlin?
Yes, it is. I think that they have to. First of all, it's an overriding mantra that he has in dealing in fora like the United Nations and all that, whether countries support it or not. He has to be selective where he can visit. Mongolia is fairly safe. I think that Russia shares a long border of Mongolia. Mongolia is not going to cross Putin and Russia. You go to other countries, and that risk is there. The variable. And if he can't 100% count on it, he's not going to do it. So he has done a fair amount of regional travel in the last year. Remember, the first year and a half, he was, he was Bunker Vladimir. He didn't move. So I think he has to pay attention to it. It's real, and as such, he won't overreach. The fact he didn't go to South Africa was telling. One of the BRICS, in theory, would have not supported the ICC, but there are a lot of ways that that airplanes can be escorted mid-flight somewhere, or overflight, or landing, and he's not going to go there.
For more news on the war in Ukraine, early access to our videos, live streams, and members-only Q&As, sign up for a Times Radio membership at the link in the description. Goodbye.